Hello? Hi, good evening, everyone. Okay. All right. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm grateful for your enthusiasm for the Warhol and our programming. My name is Jose Diaz, Chief Curator here at the Andy Warhol Museum. Tonight's program, A Conversation on Andy Warhol and Religion, was inspired by my many conversations with Dr. Paula Kane in preparation for the exhibition, Andy Warhol Revelation. Please note that the exhibition is on view this evening, free of charge until 9 p.m., and will close on February 16th. It will then travel to the Speed Art Museum in Louisville, Kentucky, and open on April 3rd, so if you want to join us there, please do. The exhibition not only highlights and brings to light Warhol's Byzantine Catholic faith, it also presents artworks made by Warhol with spiritual imagery. This includes holiday greeting card designs from the 1950s, an unfinished film commissioned by the Catholic Church in 1967, a pop version of Da Vinci's Annunciation, all the way through his final body of work themed around the Last Supper. Over the course of his prominent and prolific career, Andy Warhol both pictured a religious subject matter and practiced his faith. Yet in 20th century histories of modern American art, religion is largely excluded. This conversation between Erika Doss, Professor of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame, and Paula Kane, Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Pittsburgh, considers what religion meant to Warhol, how his religious beliefs shaped and directed his art, and why religion matters in the history of American modernism. For this evening's program, I would like to thank the University of Pittsburgh's Religious Studies Department, especially former intern Kenneth Warrenberger, and our program assistant Sarah Kim for setting up tonight's logistics. I would also like to thank our sponsors, Bank of America, the National Endowment for the Arts, the Fine Foundation, and William A. Stevens. Finally, I wanted to acknowledge Patrick Moore, Donald Warhola, and Father Thomas Schaefer from St. John Chrysostom, Byzantine Catholic Church, for supporting my research, the exhibition, and the programming. Paula Kane, here on the left side, is the John and Lucine O'Brien Marous Chair in Contemporary Catholic Studies at the University of Pittsburgh with a joint appointment in the Department of History. She researches and teaches American religious history with a specialization in modern Catholicism. She is the author of 2 books and numerous book chapters on Catholicism and art, film, and sacred architecture. Paula Kane is co-editor of Catholic Gender Identities in America and serves on the editorial boards of several scholarly journals, including American Catholic Studies. Erika Doss is Professor of American Studies at the University of Notre Dame, the recipient of several Fulbright Awards. Erika Doss has also held fellowships at the Stanford Humanities Center, the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum Research Center, and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. She is the author of 7 books covering a wide range of topics in American art and visual culture. We welcome you both to the Andy Warhol Museum. Thank you.
Thanks, Jose. I would like to thank Jose Diaz again for his invitation to work with the Warhol once again, and for his energy and excitement about this project throughout. So I think it's great that it's going to go to the Brooklyn Museum and the Speed Museum after this. I'd like to also thank Sarah Kim for her excellent assistance with slides and the details of a presentation like this, and to thank Erika Doss for agreeing to come from South Bend to participate in this event. And to you, audience, for making an effort to encourage and support art on a winter's night. So, we'll start in kind of a dire place. The Cathedral of Notre Dame burning in April of 2019. And I wanted to start here because I think it's a good way to help us think about how religious art remains important in the contemporary era. So even in France, which is a very secular state now and has been edging that way since the French Revolution in 1789, even in France, where less than 4% of Catholics attend Mass, there was a huge outpouring of national emotion, tears, money, and so forth, and the cathedral roof burned. So obviously this event was quite moving to many French people, and it struck me that even in our time, when we talk about people being unaffiliated or disaffiliated from religion or disenchanted with religion, that a building like this has that power. So even in France, a Catholic symbol also bleeds over into being a kind of national symbol, which I find very, very intriguing. And so that the medieval cathedral also reminds us that for centuries, religion has been an enormous source of inspiration for art, production of art. And since I'm a historian, I tend to think of things historically. So we ask, why are they here now? Where did they come from? And so forth. And we will hopefully hear a lot more about that theme as we're moving along. I think we're to you.
Okay.
Okay.
Also, my thanks to Sarah, Jose, to everybody here at the museum for this terrific exhibit. It's really a great way to start thinking about Andy Warhol and religion, which is really what we want to talk about with you this evening. Paula's comments are helpful in reminding us about the materiality or the material culture of religion. And that's a nice segue in terms of thinking about Andy Warhol, who is very much engaged in the material culture of religion, and particularly his Catholic faith. Andy Warhol is the modern artist. He made hundreds of pictures of religious subjects throughout his career, especially towards the end of his life, more than 100 paintings and drawings based on Leonardo's The Last Supper, sort of riffing on this 19th century copy of Leonardo's Last Supper, that incredible scene of devotion and betrayal. He's playing around with things in camouflage and day glow and repetitive patterning, juxtaposing images of Christ and his disciples with images of motorcycles, price tags, logos for Wise potato chips, Dove soap, General Electric, Camel cigarettes, Heinz 57. Remaking Leonardo's mural, the art historian Jane Dillenberger said, in terms of a new spiritual resonance. Okay, so Andy Warhol is one of the best-known modern artists of the past century. Less well-known, but increasingly known, is that he was an observant Catholic who carried a rosary, went to church every week, sometimes more than once. Raised here in Pittsburgh in the Byzantine Catholic or Eastern Rite Church, he sustained his faith as an adult. He is seen here in a meeting with the Pope in 1980. There's his gravestone. This is the interior of his home on East 66th Street. He collected devotional paintings and devotional sculptures. He kept a crucifix by his bedside. His mom, who lived with him until she passed in 1992, or 92? Yeah, 92, maintained a small shrine in the house. Not 92, 72, sorry. On Christmas and holidays, Warhol served meals to the homeless at various churches. It's important, I think, to think about Warhol this way, and we'll come back to his church attendance here in Pittsburgh, where his funeral was held. One important sort of influence in this sort of Catholic connection is Sister Corita Kent. Now, I know there was an exhibit here in 2015 of her work, and it's interesting that Warhol is often cited as an influence on her, but I think it's interesting to think about how Sister Corita actually started making screen prints in the mid-50s. She's teaching in California. Priests and nuns came from all over the country to work with her in California. And her work was widely reproduced in Catholic newsletters of the late 50s, early 60s. So it might be interesting to sort of rethink the Warhol-Sister Corita connection and sort of consider, is she the influence on him? More so. Let's just think about that. Over a very prolific, very productive career, Andy Warhol obviously produced a lot of religious paintings, or paintings rather that included religious subject matter. He also practiced his religious faith. He's not alone. We can think of many American moderns There's a show of Agnes Pelton's work that is traveling the country. We'll be at the Whitney this spring. Marsden Hartley, Mark Tobey, Barnett Newman. In more recent decades, Paul Tech, Robert Gober, Andre Serrano, Kiki Smith, all playing with the visual and material cultures of various religions as artistic sources and inspirations. Each developing what I like to think about in terms of a spiritual modernism. But in art history, and sort of an art historical recounting of modern art in general, religion has been largely, until relatively recently, overlooked and even ignored. And there are a lot of different reasons for that, and we can jump into talking about this. Sort of an assumption that modernism is on one scale and religion is on the other side, that they're inherently oppositional, that modern art is even anti-religious or anti-religion.
And certainly a lot of that stemmed from what we now address as a secularization thesis about the modern world, in which, presumably following sociologists like Max Weber, that the world has become progressively disenchanted. The spiritual elements have been purged out, and rightly so, to make room for progress, rationalism, science, and so forth and so on. And one of the confounding things that probably you and I perceive at the same time is that living in the United States is kind of anomalous, because of all of the industrialized or post-industrialized nations of the world. The United States stands out as kind of defying that secularization thesis, that people still do claim to believe in God, that people still are active in religious communities. And even though those numbers have gone down, particularly in the last 15 years, that compared to Europe, where the secular is pretty much what is on the landscape, the United States still looks like a quite religious place. And I think during Andy's lifetime, he was living across that divide between the world of immigrant Catholics and Jews, who were quite religious and building communities to sustain their faith, to a world after, say, Vatican II, after the Holocaust, in which case there was a lot of questioning about the meaningfulness of religion and even the existence of God.
Yeah, I think today there's real questioning about this secularization thesis or theory of modernity, but it is prevalent. It is very, very strong in the post-war period. Michael Warner remarks that secularization theory originated in a, quote, potent Enlightenment mythology that regarded religion as a primitive remnant. So we have Weber, we have Emil Durkheim, we have intellectuals and historians who are basically saying that the era of religious faith is immature, superstitious, based in magic. It's the dark ages before modernity. We may question this today, but this is the sort of the template in intellectual quarters until relatively recently. And I think both Paula and I want to question that, and I know that the artist that we'll talk about definitely question that, because what this tends to do is define religion as dogma, as creed, and as deference to church authority, and misjudge what's actually happening in 20th century America in terms of the shifting meaning of religion as subjective mystical experience, the individual search for transcendence.
I think that one of the things I've learned studying Catholics in the United States is that they have consistently provided a kind of counter-modernity or an anti-modern outlook at times that has been quite countercultural. So if our narrative of a secular, increasingly secularizing world comes to us largely from a Protestant history and a history written by Protestants about religion in America, Catholics have been the one constantly disrupting that narrative, because things like the devotional practices we'll talk about, the ethnic neighborhoods and churches that sustained the Warhols and families like them, all of those things defied this narrative of a constantly ever-progressing modernity. And so even though, as we'll see, Vatican II is a huge divide among Catholics themselves, for these generations of immigrants, their children and grandchildren, there was a whole question about, well, what is the center of your life? And for many of them it was the parish church, the diocese, the world of the Catholic school,
Right.
the Catholic organization, and so forth and so on.
But still, there's this, this sense in these questions that we pose here that there's this disconnect. So these are just some questions that we're posing in terms of how can we ultimately better think or better historicize the situation for artists like Warhol, who were modern artists and religious. And I think it's really important, showing some examples of his work here. And I always love to show examples of people engaging with his work, which is sort of the function of icons. Icons depend on our engagement with them. They're not just paintings, but they're literally activated in terms of touching, obviously looking, but even more, they're activated by the dynamic sort of experience that we have with them. So I think he was also very, very interested in people looking, thinking about his work. What I want to point out is that Andy Warhol is not a religious artist. And I think that there are a lot of assumptions that when we talk about an artist engaging in religious subject matter or being religious, that they're religious artists. This is a good example of a religious artist. Warner Sallman, you can't get much better than that. Well, actually you can, and I'll show him in just a minute, but what does it mean to be a religious artist? To be a religious artist is to illustrate, affirm, and proselytize on behalf of a certain religion. And that's certainly what Warner Sallman is doing. Warner Sallman is an advertising agent in Chicago. He's also very engaged in the Swedish Lutheran Church. He comes up with this idea for the Aryan Jesus, as I sometimes call him, in the 1920s, and then in 1940, he paints him in what is estimated as the most popular reproduced image, as if we could figure that out, but incredibly popular. Let me put it this way. Paintings done in 1940, when we get involved in World War II, little 3x5, is that about right? Reproductions of Warner Sallman's Head of Christ were put in every GI's billfold. So this is an incredibly popular image. And here he is painting it over here. All right, so now for another religious artist, because I know you couldn't just stop with Warner Sallman. Okay, so Warner Sallman and Thomas Kinkade are motivated by Christian religious imperatives of mass persuasion. Thomas Kinkade, you might remember him, best-selling Christian evangelical painter of light, incredibly popular until he died. In the 1990s was represented by 350 galleries. Why is this funny? And 5,000 retail outlets selling some 20 million copies of his inspirational prints. Idealized landscapes like the one we see here, accompanied by verses from the Bible that he described as, quote, vignettes to inspire the mind or soothe the soul. Warhol is not Thomas Kinkade. And he's not Warner Sallman, although I think he would have loved to have been in on some of Thomas Kinkade's money. He's a modern artist, and he is religious. And again, I thank the Warhol Museum for broaching the subject in this particular exhibit, Revelation. Can I throw in my Marcel Duchamp quote? Sure. Okay. So in 1949, Marcel Duchamp declared that modern art was in fact an aesthetic revelation that cannot be understood through the intellect, but is felt through an emotion, presenting some analogy with a religious faith. Duchamp said this at a 1949 Western Roundtable on Modern Art that was sponsored at the San Francisco Art Museum. And it's something interesting to think about in terms of already artists, right after the war, thinking about this disjunction that's appeared.
So we showed you this briefly before. I wanted to bring it back to think a little bit more about the environment that produced Andy Warhol as an artist interested in religion. So his parish in Pittsburgh, you see here, is splendidly colorful, an enormous icon screen at the main altar, but virtually every inch of it is decorated in some kind of way. And so in the Greek Catholic world, the Byzantine church, he grew up surrounded by color, icons, incense, sound, chant particularly. And these certainly come through, particularly in his icon paintings, which is an easy match to make. But I think if we look even at his bedroom, you can see that he kind of styles himself as a Renaissance prince, or maybe even a pope, with the high postered canopy bed and a lot of red, the oriental carpets.
Have you been watching The Two Popes? Or the
Yes,
new Pope? Yeah, okay.
When I can bear it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's definitely fashioning himself in that way. And at the bottom, you see the kind of religious stuff, the junk that he collected from all over New York, flea markets and junk sales and so forth. So he was an avid collector of, I think, Catholic imagery of both high and low types. And I wanted to turn to some of the high types that inspired him as well. So the Catholic Church has a long and glorious tradition of being a patron of the arts and a sponsor of the arts and the source of art. So basically, since the first century Christian era, when the Christian churches emerge, we find developing images associated with the life of Christ, his mother, various angels, and over time, the martyrs and saints that join the roster of those who are painted. So if we think about Christian art, for the first 14 centuries after Christ, 14 centuries, virtually all art was sacred art. And we find it full of biblical themes from both testaments, the lives of Jesus, Mary, the saints, the martyrs. And during the Renaissance, what's so fascinating, as most of us learned in Renaissance art courses, is that the Renaissance artists rediscover the classical world, the world of classical antiquity. So now it's not just about painting saints and martyrs and Jesus, but you can paint a lot of other things besides, nudes and scenes from all those mythologies and so forth and so on. But for our purposes, Andy was interested and knew something of this heritage of the great Renaissance painters. So we just picked several of the famous greatest hits here: Da Vinci's Virgin of the Rocks at the Louvre, a round painting or tondo by Michelangelo, and a Raphael Transfiguration. So obviously the use of well-saturated color, lots of figures in motion, dimensionality, and so forth and so on are very characteristic of this era. The Assumption of the Virgin by Titian, another Titian Madonna, give us a kind of sense of the characteristic landscape and topics that went into all this energy of Renaissance painting. So what I want to just point us toward is thinking about the fact that when you look at a painting, you are engaged in the act of looking, which might sound kind of trite, but the act of looking opens up a space between you, the viewer, and the object being looked at. So for example, if I look at a painting of the Madonna and Child, or the Madonna, it opens up that devotional space between me and the Virgin Mary. And the saint is reaching out to me, the viewer, and I am imputing my desires, fantasies, wishes, hopes, fears into that maternal figure of the Madonna, whom I already believe will be able to take care of me because she is the Mother of God. So a lot of this Renaissance art was also devotional alongside that secular world, and this devotional world is what we'll think a lot about when we think of Andy Warhol. So let us move to the next one. Okay.
At the same time.
At the same time, yes. All religion is material religion is an interesting phrase by another scholar in our field. So what does this mean? I think it means that without objects, we have no religion. Religions, even religions like Hinduism that don't rely on a personal or a singular god, rely on objects, beads, flowers, oil, candles, and so forth. So what we learn in the study of religion is that without objects, there really is no religion. Objects are crucial to the performance of religion. And Warhol, it happens, lived in the heyday of what we call devotional Catholicism, perhaps from the 1920s through the 1960s. He lived during that heyday, the flourishing of Catholic culture throughout the world, especially in the United States, and he'll live past it, the transition from Vatican II afterwards. So let me just talk a little bit about this homely object, the St. Jude prayer card. Catholics have a rich tradition of stuff, using stuff as part of their faith.
It's okay to call it
Elaborated-
stuff.
Yeah, we call it stuff,
okay.
material stuff.
Yeah.
So in addition to the elements that are associated with the 7 sacraments, water, wine, oil, bread, and so forth, over the century we have a ton of other objects that have emerged for devotional use: rosaries, icons, crucifixes, statues, home altars, religious medals, prayer cards, etiquette manuals, comic books, candles, holy water fonts, and so on. And so there's still today an international market for these kinds of Catholic souvenirs, and you may yourself own some of them. So Andy, as we said, was fond of collecting this stuff from flea markets and junk shops in New York City, and in the show you'll see a photograph of him standing with his buddies in a bathroom where he hung over the mirror a seashell crucifix, a really good example of kitsch art, seashell crucifix, that he hung in the bathroom at Broadway. Let's see where it
Okay,
comes
so
up.
he's in the bathroom with the seashells.
Okay.
Right.
All right, so we're thinking still about material religion, and what does this mean?
Imagine, if you will.
Yeah, so this is really an important, it brings to mind an important theological concept that's behind all of this, that for Christians, God became human. The God took on human form, took on flesh, became a human person, which implies that God is not absent from the world, but in fact present in the world, and is always present within and around all the objects that are made sacred by the humans who worship that God. So the point I'm making is, again, perhaps kind of obvious, but that God's presence is recognized and made palpable, made real, made concrete through objects.
But there's also the tie-in there to modern capitalism, which certainly helps make more objects, make them available, sort of the democratization, if you will, of the Catholic stuff, right?
Yeah, and that whole industry of souvenir purchasing and spreading it around the world is certainly a part of Catholic culture as well. So no matter how profane or satirical or silly you might find some of Warhol's creations, God's presence is always lurking there. It is a sign of God's presence. So if we see the dove hanging over the head of Christ in Andy's Last Supper, is it a profound sign, the dove symbol from the Dove soap bar? Is it a profound sign? Is it a superficial sign?
Right.
Is it a spiritual sign? Is it a commercial
Or is it
sign?
all of those
Is
things?
it all those things at once in the 20th century? So the point I'm making here is simply that God's presence is what all these religious objects are about, and that is precisely where I think the Catholic world and the Protestant worlds diverge. In the modern Protestant take on things, it's the absent God who's being
Right.
worried about, anxiously sought after, whereas for Catholics this presence is always there. Oh, okay. We'll
'Cause
keep talking.
This was where we were going to talk about pre-Vatican II Latin
That's true.
Mass.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
There's something going on here. And we were going to talk about the kind of Catholicism that Andy grew up with.
Indeed.
How would we describe that if we're not going to show it?
Devotional. It's a really devotional type of Catholicism.
Good.
So if the Protestants in America were concerned with describing their beliefs as a set of affirmations of faith and thinking that the Word of God is how I encounter God through Scripture, Protestantism can be thought of as a religion of the ear, right? The Word is heard, the Word is preached.
And the book.
The gospel is understood by these means. Yes, Protestants were kind of resistant to it being a religion of the eyes because that was a slippery slope to idolatry, right? Those invasions of the commandment. And so, true to form, I think in the exhibition you'll see that Andy did a couple of images that remind us of that Protestant world in America. So when we see the silkscreen, repent and sin no more, these are images made of words, right? Which is kind of funny, to me at least. Whereas for Catholics, the idea of the presence of God in a variety of things, whether it was a crucifix or a symbol of the created, other symbols of the created world, that was a much more important thing because the eye was making that connection. And one of the things that's happened, I think, since the 60s to now with the media revolutions of various sorts, print, obviously going back to the Reformation era, but with television and certainly our electronic communications, some people have argued that religion and modern media are two sides of the same coin. So commodification is the part of that where we earlier mentioned the fact that religion can be reduced to a thing that is simply bought and sold. And so a lot of Andy's work, problematizes that recognition. Is the Holy Spirit really like a bar of soap? And I think that Miranda Lash noted in the exhibition catalog that the sacred object and the commercial object are not mutually exclusive.
And we have a wonderful slide, which you're going to have to imagine now, of all of the Catholic kitsch at Lourdes, which sort of explains all of this.
We'll get there. Okay.
Catholic kitsch. And I think the exhibit does a wonderful job as well of installing some of the icon panels in the church that Warhol attended as a child. So all of this rich visual material culture. Oh, okay. Is there to see. Where do we want to go from here?
Well, I think we were interested in the fact that the medieval world of Catholic imagery was quite extensive. The Renaissance opened that up to the more profane or secular world. But in the United States, there is still yet this divide between a Protestant aesthetic, we'll say, and a Catholic aesthetic. And what's fascinating, again, about Andy in this art world of his time is that he is deliberately and consciously playing with a lot of those Catholic symbols for audiences that were many of them becoming post-immigrant. They are no longer just off the boat Catholic immigrants in the United States. They've been here a while. So their children and grandchildren are thinking, I don't know how connected I want to be to that Catholic church, right? Maybe it's a little too harsh. And the 60s is certainly the moment when a lot of hell breaks loose around the power of tradition versus the power of
It's interesting, too, how many of the folks in the studio and at the factory were Catholic. And sort of understood some of the sources, the influences, and the subjects that he was showing. But I think you're right. I think that what happens in the 60s, 70s, and up to today is sort of a falling out of religious subject matter that people go, oh, I understand that story, or oh, I understand that myth. This is the nature of religion in America, which we can talk about. But the other thing that's interesting, you use the phrase playing around with, is that's really, really essential. He is interrogating, if you will. He isn't proselytizing again, but he's looking at and questioning his faith on so many different levels. So now we'll move forward to the Catholic kitsch part.
My favorite.
Her favorite, yes.
Past
the real art, right.
Renaissance. Okay, here we are.
Okay, back to the cards.
Phew. Our hopeless causes are solved. Okay.
It's the card's fault.
We were thinking about material religion and what it means, and I was very struck by the presence of these typical Catholic prayer cards all over Julia Warhola's and Andy's lives. So let's think about St. Jude for a minute, the card on the right. This is a saint who emerges, believe it or not, during Andy's lifetime to be a signature cult in the United States. So why did this happen? Jude emerges during the Great Depression as this patron saint of lost causes. He wasn't really a very popular saint in Catholic tradition until that point. And a cult of Jude emerges, formed mostly by women in the 1920s and 30s who were praying to the saint to get jobs for their husbands, brothers, sons, and so forth and so on. So women really made this cult. And what's fascinating about those women is they're kind of like Andy. They're not themselves immigrants, but they're the children and grandchildren of immigrants. So a shrine in Chicago becomes kind of the central clearinghouse of the St. Jude activism in America, run by the Claretian order. And what's fascinating is that all over the country, people send in letters to the shrine asking, Dear St. Jude, what shall I do about my brother who can't get a job, his factory is closed, and so forth. So these letters were all answered by a Father Robert, who turned out to be not a real person, but sort of a committee of women answering the mail at the shrine, right? This is sort of like the Nancy Drew books being created by the Havermeyer Syndicate and not actually by Carolyn Keene. So anyway, women did make the cult. And when Warhol was born, Jude was relatively obscure, but he comes to be a big saint for the Depression era. Right. So look at the image. We have a very kindly looking Jude he looks kind of like Solomon's Jesus, right? He looks kind of gentle and nice and handsome like Jesus, and he's holding or wearing a very large neck plate, breastplate of the image of the Savior on it. So Jude had to be distinguished from Judas, because his name sounds alike, by being the kindly, gentle saint that women could like and admire. And the prayer which goes along with that, which is one that's still familiar to Catholics, was something you'd pray in desperate times. So these things are distributed by the millions and end up everywhere across the world. So it's really a combination of the printing techniques that emerge that allow this colorful printing at cheap levels. And it doesn't matter that you have a copy of a St. Jude card that's a copy of 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 a Saint card, because for Catholics, the card still conveys the same force. So let's think about that. It isn't a matter that the card is diminished because it's a copy of a copy of a copy. We think about this in Warhol's art. He's making copies of copies of copies. But it's still spiritually forceful. And the card isn't really the main thing. The main thing is you, the believer, activating the card's energies by, in fact, ritual action. So saying the prayer on the back of the card is the part of yourself, making it part of yourself. That's the important gesture you're conducting here. And so I think that the belief that the saint can help you by his connection to the Lord is what's activated, particularly in the case of Jude, which is why he became the premier saint for the Depression era and still remains a powerful saint in America today. And the other assortment of holy cards here are of the generic types we find all over this Catholic devotional world. So, yes, we'll move to Kitsch. Yes, okay.
Okay.
So,
and I suppose you could say the same thing about these objects. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that what I love about this kind of stuff, and I do collect a lot of it myself, is that relics have power, even though they might be copies or bastard copies or more and more diminished copies of copies and so forth and so on. But that this world of kitsch is alive among Catholics is kind of fascinating to me as well. That the sacred object becomes a commercial object, and they're present at all these shrine sites at various spots around the world. So this one in Lourdes, France, a very powerful shrine that's second only to Rome in terms of the number of the pilgrims that go there. So if you've been to Rome and seen the Vatican, you're always struck by the thousands of kitschy shops all around with papal memorabilia and so forth and so on. And Andy loved all this stuff, which I have to appreciate.
And so it's interesting to think, and here's some more examples on the local front.
Yes, this is from my neighborhood. I just took it at Christmas time to talk about what we call suburban fake lore, right? So this is a person who's collected a lot of stuff through the years, and I found it intriguing that the manger is kind of way off here on the right side. He's sort of not really central to the story anymore, but the Victorian carolers, the Santa Claus, the fireplace, and all these various things. There's hundreds. He's off to the side over here. There's a whole other scene I couldn't fit in the photo, with thousands of candy canes and so forth. Plus, there's carols that are playing as you walk by.
So what are we talking about
the
here?
house?
We're inventing or reinventing the religion.
That's right.
Through material culture.
Yes.
So Warhol is doing this despite the fact that he is growing up with this kind of pre-Vatican II Mass, which we're hoping we can play a little bit of.
Yes.
And we'll come back to that. And this, of course, being the sort of church that he actually grows up in.
So the world Andy's growing up in before Vatican II is that of the Latin Mass and also the Byzantine rite that he attended, even longer than the Latin Mass. So this was a very traditional liturgy in which the priests and altar servers congregated in sort of a lump at the altar with their backs to the congregation and chanted the words of Mass in Latin. So this was quite mysterious to a congregation because nobody spoke Latin in the 1950s and 60s. You had a missal which had the Latin on one side and the English on the other. And it wasn't really a participatory Mass, right? This was a performance that was done for you, and you, the congregation, were like a spectator model here. Nonetheless, there was glorious music and a lot of costuming, And when Vatican II made changes to this liturgy, pulled the altars forward, turned the priest around to face the congregation, turned the liturgy out of Latin into the vernacular languages of wherever you were living, this upset a lot of people. And those who resisted the shifts mourned the loss of something they thought was significant about their identity. So we don't really know Andy's opinions about the pre- and post-Vatican II Mass at all, but I think my larger point would be that this is the point at which we start to see sacrilege and parody emerging in art and popular culture to make fun of some of those changes. So we'll see lots of stuff relating to nuns, attacks on nuns for changing their habits and no longer acting nunnish and so forth. We'll see all kinds of parodies that continue down to the present day in Saturday Night Live skits and so forth, and Broadway shows about nuns. So I'd say nuns were definitely a recognizable figure that made this transition through Vatican II and became an object of parody and satire in popular culture.
So we're talking about themes of reinvention and sort of reimagining. These are the panels that he grows up with in the church. This is the iconostasis of the church.
Huge.
This is that separation that Paul is talking about. What I think is interesting to sort of expand on this is this parody, repetition, reinvention is shared by so many artists. So here's Andy taking a look at these fine art, high art examples of Catholic religionism, remaking, reinventing, rethinking. And he's not alone in this. I love this shot of his studio to give you a sense of just how cluttered it is and how much stuff is actually going on. And we can look at this in terms of mixing it up. GE, we bring good things to light. And then the dove over the head of Jesus coming out of Mark. He is definitely engaged in both the secular and the sacred in this kind of work. And he's not alone. So, very quickly, artists from Paul Tech to Robert Gober are also Catholic, are also queer, are also engaged in reimagining what it means to be religious, what it means to have faith in a secular age. So Tech here is making his meat pieces, Warhol, and Warhol gives him a Brillo box, and Tech puts some of his sort of meat sculptures inside. I think this one's at the Museum of Modern Art.
I think this is at the Whitney.
Okay.
But
right.
can I say a word about that?
Yep.
Okay, so Paul Tech, there was a Paul Tech show at the Carnegie Museum perhaps 4 or 5 years ago, and I was intrigued to learn that he did a lot of these pieces after coming back from Italy, where he'd spent a lot of time in the catacombs of various religious orders and looking at all these gory representations of the martyrs and the lives of the saints. And he came back, and surprisingly, in this world of abstract art and of this Protestant modernism,
and
he makes these very fleshy pieces of fake meat. So they're chicken wire with beeswax and resin on top of them. And they're pretty realistic and kind of gory, but they're kind of funny to me because they really do represent this Catholic sense of embodiment, right? That the God became flesh, and flesh cannot be bad. And we're reminded of our fleshiness. It's a symbol of mortality, and also a sense of the transformative power of that flesh to become something different in an afterlife.
And we get the same with Gober.
Yeah.
Gober is in this installation piece from 1997, which some of you may know was at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. He's piercing a fairly large, about 7.5 foot tall plaster statue of the Virgin with this gigantic sewer pipe. And then there are thousands of other details associated with that. But the point here is that these artists, having been raised Catholic and considering themselves Catholic, are challenging, in a sense, what it means to be Catholic. So Serrano, who's Piss Christ, we see on the left, remarks that he has unresolved feelings about his Catholic upbringing, and these unresolved feelings help me redefine and personalize my relationship with God. For me, art is a moral and spiritual obligation that cuts across all manner of pretense and speaks directly to the soul. Kiki Smith on the right in her Virgin Mary piece creates these kinds of sculptures that diverge from the traditional Judeo-Christian representation of the Mother of God as a divine conduit of grace. And this is the abject body, nude, her head shaved, her skin flayed. A lot of people interpret this as the kind of work that she turned to after her post-college job as an emergency med tech, and thus her interest in trauma and vulnerability. But she says, look, I've always been spiritual. That's always been the most important part of my life, thinking about God, thinking about gods. My whole life I've wanted to believe in a God, find some kind of God that I could make a shrine to, but I can't. I never do. I keep trying.
We should perhaps remind you, if you didn't already know, that the Piss Christ image caused quite a lot of problems because it's actually a photograph of a standard issue crucifix submerged in a beaker of urine. And this created enormous
Still does.
brouhaha in New York when this show went up. And if you see them as just simply photographs, they're actually quite beautiful photographs, but the title does give an indication that something else is going on here, which led us to think a lot about the presence of bodily fluids in modern art and how pretty much all of these artists experiment in some way with urine, in Andy's
body.
case, the body.
Right,
yeah, it's a sense
right.
of how the body is reflecting something about themselves, their own time.
But Warhol's different. I mean, he's not as engaged, I think, as in the abject.
Yeah.
He's got a sense of humor in many ways.
Yeah.
And that leads us to Tom Sachs.
Yes. So maybe some of you saw or have seen the Hello Kitty Nativity, one of my favorites. And there was an interesting struggle about this piece. So in 1994, Simon Doonan, who you probably know from various television shows, was working at Barney's in Manhattan, and he solicited artists to submit displays for the Barney's windows. And the Hello Kitty Nativity came in, and if we could... if you look a little closer, there we go. Okay. You can see it's a creche with a McDonald's sign on top, so it's already about commodification, questioning that. And of the figures inside, we have Bart Simpson in the back as one of the wise men. But what really raised the ire of various, particularly conservative Catholics, was the representation of the Virgin Mary. She's sort of in a fetish object, fetish attire here, and her legs are wide open.
That's what did it? That's what got them?
That's what got them upset. Okay. So it was really an interesting moment in the culture wars because this self-appointed Catholic League that emerged in New York, led by William Donohue, protested this, and I think he had to eventually take that installation out. But to his credit, Tom Sachs, at least, was one of 309 displays in the windows at that time, so probably it wouldn't have been so visible and so offensive as people might have imagined. So this kind of display led us to wonder, can kitsch go too far? Can you really veer over into realms of bad taste or poor taste? It certainly seems possible.
But it's also a good example of artists who are, again, interrogating the assumptions, the expectations that exist among mainstream audiences about how certain scenes should be represented, about how certain people from the Bible ought to be represented. And Mary Beth Edelson here, feminist artist in the 1970s, is definitely questioning that in this wonderful Last Supper piece that she did for the cover of Heresies magazine, which was a feminist art journal.
Yeah, I just saw this piece at MoMA a few days ago, and I didn't know much about it till I saw it, but it's kind of humorous because Georgia O'Keeffe has become Jesus, and Yoko Ono and Alice Neal and a lot of the artist's friends are there in the Last Supper, and there's no Judas in this image, but her riff on patriarchy would probably take down Andy as well as all the other male pop artists of his day.
So in the end, what can we conclude?
We have to think that all religion is material religion, and that objects are super important to art and the representation of art, that Andy is a modern, as you said, religious artist.
And we should accept that.
We should accept that. And that the title of Jose's exhibition, Revelation, is important, right? It's revealed something to us about Andy as a modern man who was gay, but for whom his gay identity might have been less problematic than his religious identity in the art world.
I think that's a place to start. I think that it's a great place to start thinking about how can we understand this intersection between faith and the sacred in modern times. It obviously exists. I have always argued for more efficacious understandings of the cultural work of religion in modern times, and it's been interesting because often people will think that by saying that, that we are proselytizing on behalf of a particular religion or a religious ideology, and that's not the case whatsoever. I think by looking at Warhol as this exhibit does, as a modernist who's religious, it opens up so many new and different ways of thinking about what modern art is, or has been over the past, let's say, 50 years, particularly in this post-war era when the secularization theory did dominate in intellectual and historical circles.
You know, you didn't get to see the portion of the Latin Mass, but one thing that struck me working with the museum staff is how important this close-up archival work is, because it uncovered the fact that Andy Warhol, as an adult man living in Manhattan, went to Mass almost every day, something that a lot of his friends weren't even aware of. And I found it kind of fascinating that he went to Mass, but he would often only stay sometimes 10 minutes. He did not always go to communion. He did not interest himself in confession. Mm-hmm. And this led us to questions about his identity and identifications. Did he not take communion because he felt himself in a state of sin? Did he not go to confession for the same reasons, because he was a gay man? Or was he showing a kind of contempt for that sort of administrative and authoritarian structure that he didn't want to be a part of, and therefore he chose his moments and places to be present at Mass? He also was fairly shy, so he didn't like to be recognized at Mass, which is one reason why he said he would kind of go in and out. I think Jose uses the word clandestine Catholic to describe him, which is good. I refer to him as a furtive man of faith. But it does open up both those identity questions about him as well as the larger art historical questions that Erika
I think it's interesting to think what might have happened had this 1967 commission gone through. So this is we can watch it upstairs, 33-minute film. For purpose, I'm just going to call it Sunset, commissioned by the de Menil family in Houston. These are the folks who commissioned Rothko for the Rothko Chapel. So we can talk about Rothko and also talk about the Rothko Chapel, but we don't have that opportunity until this exhibit to talk about Warhol in the same way. It would have been quite interesting had this actually been finalized. It was commissioned for a World's Fair in San Antonio for a pavilion that the Vatican was going to sponsor, but they pulled out of it. So.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a crucial moment because Vatican II had just ended in 1965, and there was already a backing away from some of that progressive democratization of the institution by 1967. So many of you who live in Pittsburgh might have heard of Mary Lou Williams, African-American Catholic jazz composer. She wrote a jazz mass in 1967, but it was never officially recognized, never performed by the Vatican. So I think in that year, 67, there was a lot going on about art and liturgy and music in which many of the higher ups in the Catholic Church said, wait a minute, we've opened the window too far here, we must recede a bit. But you'll see Sunset in the show and make your own conclusions about it.
Please see it. It's a terrific exhibit. So we're going to finish up, but we would be happy to take a couple of questions if you're interested, and thank you.
Thank you.
Questions? Okay.
I actually have a comment and a question. One question I would like to, I was wondering if you could scroll back to his studio. I would like to see that photo again. And then my comment is, you mentioned the Hello Kitty nativity. I suggest you Google the hipster nativity. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, okay. Excuse me.
I'm just curious, what, if any implications you see of the fact that around the time that we're sort of talking here, Catholicism is still viewed by at least Protestant America as a cult. And that's sort of going on around this time, particularly, with Kennedy's, election and so forth, or leading up to the election. If there's any implications there in all of this discussion.
I don't know how engaged Warhol was in a lot of those debates, but I can tell you as a historian that yes, the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan marches against Kennedy's campaign, Kennedy's obligatory speech to the Southern Baptists ministers in Houston, saying that I will be a president of all the people, I'm not in lockstep with the Vatican and so forth, was a kind of interesting moment for Catholics to have to no longer be apologetic about being Catholic, but reassuring Protestants that we're not going to make you into Catholics like us, right? It's a very odd moment. And I don't know what Andy felt about that. He seemed to like the celebritydom of the Kennedys generally, right? Hence the fascination with Jackie. But I don't know if Protestants still regarded it as a cult. This was the largest single church in America since the 1850s. Roman Catholics outnumbered everybody else simply by sheer immigration early on. If we added up all the Protestant churches, we could say there's more Protestants in America, but as the singular church, the largest church was the Catholic Church. So I don't think that they felt that kind of sense of being cultish, even if that language was used by the more fundamentalist Protestant ministers.
And I think that cover I showed of Sister Corita Kent, Newsweek, 1967, also sort of suggests what's going on. There's just, I can think of so many things, Song of Music, et cetera. Yeah, there's a veering away from that, but that's a really good thing to think about. Yeah. So.
Any other questions? Okay. Oh, one more. Okay, we'll do one more.
You had shown a picture of Andy's apartment. Is that still the way it was? Is that something that's been
I don't
preserved?
think so. I think the apartment was sold, and those are just wonderful photographs from Metropolitan Magazine or something. So. But that's a good question. Is Andy Warhol is the artist house, the studio house? Is that no?
Okay, all right. Oh, and we have one more. And then just so you all know, the exhibition is open till 9, and I do want you to go upstairs and check it out. So.
Thank you for the wonderful conversation. One of the things that I found so exciting about the exhibition is that it really made us to rethink about what it means to be Catholic and what it means to be an artist who is gay. It shows that there's more than one way to be Catholic, and there's more than one way to be an artist who is gay. For me, the Catholicism of Andy Warhol comes from his agon, the kind of struggle between spirituality and the carnality, and when we talk about Warhol as a modernist, I think we're doing injustice to modernism, as well as Warhol, who was finding his work creativity in the ruins of modernism, ushering in postmodernism. And when we talk about Catholicism, we talk about it here as though it's a one thing. Catholicism is many things, and I think that perhaps the struggle that is at the core of Catholic belief that might have been most profoundly germinating for Warhol. And my final comment with regard to the poet's comment about it was harder to be Catholic than being fag in New York in the 1960s. I'd like to hear historical evidence that Catholics being persecuted or Catholics who were afraid of being afraid for their lives in New York City in the 1960s, as gay men and women would have been afraid for their lives in Manhattan in 1960s.
I think in that quote from the poet John Giorno, what he meant was that it was more deathly in the art world for Warhol to maintain himself as a man of faith, because of course everybody else had discarded religion, that relic of the past, right? So it was awkward, not that he was being persecuted, physically, but that intellectually that was a very hard position to maintain, to be a religious artist doing the pop art that he did. Catholics had been persecuted in the 19th century, and there were still, remnants of some of that in the 20th century at the time, around the Kennedy election. But Warhol himself, I think the point was that, Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenbusch and Rauschenberg, I'm thinking of a theologian, Mapplethorpe, all this circle of gay artists working at this time in New York, had a lot to say about gay identity, but it was really not fashionable to come out as a religious person in that moment.
Well, I mean, if I may add, since I'm an art historian of queer art, it is deeply problematic to put Rauschenberg, Johns, and Warhol in one category, because Warhol was apparently very sissy. Rauschenberg and Johns ostracized Warhol. But apart from all that, the kind of, the very quote that you had about being gay and being religious in New York itself is problematic, because that binary is relying on particular linear hagiography of modernism. And what our historical scholarship has been trying in recent years is that to stay away from the linearity of modernism and bring back in plurality of what was being made in the 60s. And go back to Catholicism. I don't think that we're doing any justice for Catholicism by talking about it as monolithic
Well, certainly
faith.
not doing that. I don't think that we were talking about Catholic or modern as monolithic. Giorno's point is being made in the 60s, and particularly the early 60s, when you couldn't get a show or be reviewed if there was some demonstration that you were engaged in the spiritual, the imaginative. This was a backlash against liberal humanism in the 1950s and various other kinds of art that artists, poets were engaged in right after the war. We're not talking about a monolithic Catholicism, and I am certainly not talking about a monolithic modernism. Warhol, for me, is sort of the consummate modern on a lot of different levels, but what does that mean? Modern, for me, is an American art style and mode of thinking in the 20th century, which is all about interrogating and thinking anew and revising and reinventing. And Warhol's very much engaged in that. But I think that's enough. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, everyone.